Hey everyone, in this video I'm sharing a really nice easy recipe for 100% whole wheat sourdough bread made with pureed pumpkin, freshly cooked fresh pumpkin puree, and a beautiful bread spice mixture which is just gorgeous. For those of you who may not have ever made any bread with pumpkin or other fruit or vegetable purees, I'll just show you a really easy way to prepare the pumpkin. I know that some of you in the USA might have canned pumpkin, but canned pumpkin is not a thing here in Australia. So if we want pureed pumpkin, we have to cut it and cook it and puree it ourselves. So I'm just using a butternut pumpkin. I have made this recipe with different pumpkin varieties, but this butternut one has been my favorite so far. I also tried this recipe out, made a rye sourdough version of this and made a few different versions, but I just decided to land on this whole wheat one for the video. But honestly, this is really flexible kind of a thing. You can add pumpkin to just about any bread you like. So cut the skin off your pumpkin, take the seeds out with a spoon. You saw me scraping the seeds out. And then cut the pumpkin up into chunks, just large chunks are fine. It cooks quite quickly, so you don't need to cut it too small. And make sure you cut all that peel off. And then large chunks, and then just into a pot with some water. You don't have to be precise, just rough, big chunks is all you need. There we go, beautiful colour. And some fresh water on the top. Put a lid on it and onto the stove. It takes about 15 minutes or so to cook the pumpkin. Doesn't take long at all once it's come to the boil. So keep the lid on it, put it on high heat until it comes to a boil like that. Just make sure you're kind of nearby so you can catch it. You don't want it boiling over. But once it comes to a really good high simmer or a very light boil, then turn it down to low heat, leave the lid on, and give it about 15 minutes or so. Test it with a fork. After that, you can see I'm testing it here and it's really nice and soft. It's perfectly done. And once it's done, then you just want to drain out that water. I don't use a colander. I just use the lid method. Just put the lid slightly ajar and then just really carefully tip it out into the sink, and that works for me. And there is your freshly cooked pumpkin. I just leave it on the sink there for a while until it stops steaming, just for it to cool down a bit. And then once it stops steaming, it probably takes about 10 or 15 minutes for it to cool down enough, then you can puree it. I puree my pumpkin with a handheld blender, an immersion blender. You can see my blender's got a label up the top. It says food, and that's because I do have another one that I use for soap making. If you're a soap maker like I am as well, make sure you use a dedicated blender just for food recipes. Don't mix those two up. And I just pulse it around until the pumpkin is really soft. Don't be tempted to add any water. You don't need any other liquid. It might seem a bit firm to begin with, but you can see after you blend it up, it'll become really quite runny and liquid enough, and that's just what you want. You can also use a potato masher and just mash it really thoroughly, but I tend to get lumps when I do that, and I like mine really fine and without any lumps, so I use the blender. That works really well. And then I just portion it up into a couple of containers. I want somewhere around 400 grams of pumpkin for my recipe. So I did divide this up into 400 grams. And it turned out that I had exactly or very close to 800 grams in total pumpkin from that one pumpkin. So it was good. I got 2 loaves of bread out of it. And this is the grain that I'm using. So I'm using hard red wheat. This is Marquis variety hard red wheat that I got from Tuerong Farm. You can use any wheat variety, honestly. Just make it a whole grain flour, 100% whole grain, unsifted, and as fresh as you possibly can get it. I'm milling mine in my Mockmill, which is a wonderful little machine. And if you're interested in learning more about those, I'll put a link in the description box for where you can check the information out about those on my website. And there's the lovely red wheat grain, beautiful. So yeah, I use fresh flour, and it's pretty stunning when you're able to use fresh flour, but that's not within everybody's reach, so it's totally okay to use store-bought flours as well. I just have my mill, so I use fresh flour for everything these days. And for this recipe, I'm going to be mixing it in my little bear mixer, and this stainless steel bowl that you can see me putting the pumpkin puree into, that's the bowl part of my mixer. So I put about very close to 400 grams of the pumpkin puree in here. I did actually, you can't see it, but I added a tiny little bit of water to bring it up to the 400 grams, but that's how much liquid we need. And then to that, I added 100 grams of my sourdough starter, which is about half a cup's worth. And that's all the liquid we're using for this recipe. And then 2 teaspoons of my bread spice mixture going in. I did a video recently on how to make the bread spice if you'd like to make that yourself. It is absolutely beautiful. So we've got pumpkin puree, sourdough starter, bread spice, a tablespoon of honey I just added there, and 8 grams of salt, which is about a teaspoon and a third roughly. I will put all of the details for this recipe, a link to that on my website in the description box if you want to see the full recipe. But it's pretty easy. So I don't really use any water in this. I did add a tiny little bit to bring it up to the 400, but this is virtually a full water replacement with pumpkin. Now, I'm mixing this liquid first in my little bear mixer. This mixer is not designed for mixing liquids. It's meant for dough, which is why it's not doing a very good job of it. But I do like to put my starter and my liquids or my purees or whatever in first, and then let that mix through before I put the flour on the top. Sorry about the birds squeaking in the background. I've got really noisy birds here in summertime in Brisbane, and every time I try to record a video I get these loud birds in the background, but I hope they don't bother you. So I just turned my mixer on. I let it mix for about 15 minutes all up, and you can after a minute or so, I like to check it and just check the hydration, see that it's not too wet, but it's not too dry either. This dough is about 80% hydration, but it's mostly pumpkin puree, so it will have a very different texture than a dough that was made just with water. But the beauty of it is we're getting all that lovely pumpkin in there. It's got a great colour. It smells amazing, beautiful flavour. It's really worthwhile playing around with pumpkin puree in your bread dough. And of course it's sourdough, and you know, the fermented dough has its own magic really. It's just so much fun to play around with these kinds of things. I couldn't resist. So while the bread dough is kneading, I just clean up and feed my sourdough starter, get that fermenting before I put it back in the fridge again for the next loaf. And once the dough has finished kneading, you don't have to do this part, but I often take the little paddle out, the little paddle part of the mixer, take that out of the bowl, and then just give the dough a very light little kneading, more just to bring it together into a nice homogeneous texture, and then I put it back into the mixer to do the main fermentation. You can see I'm pushing it down into the base of the bowl, and that's because it was a bit of a cool day and my pumpkin puree was cold, my sourdough starter was cold, and I really want to warm this up, and this bear mixer has a little warming function, so I decided to put that on, just turning the time down there to 1 hour of the warming. You don't want to make it on the warming setting for hours and hours with sourdough, you'll over ferment it, and that did help speed it up. So here's the dough after it was probably about 6 or 7 hours later. It really does depend on your temperature and your environment where you are. Sourdough can take 4 hours, it can take 8 hours or even longer, depending on the season. But once it has puffed up, and you will visibly notice a rise, you want to look for a visual increase in volume of the dough, and it should have some air bubbles in it. That will be a bit harder to see. This is a fairly dense kind of a style of a dough, but you should be able to see it puffed up. And then shape it into a ball shape. You don't have to do anything fancy, just a general ball shape. And I'm going to bake this one in my Dutch oven. So I put it on a piece of non-stick baking paper, which I sprayed with water just so that the paper wouldn't stick to the dough. And then I used my little spatula to even out the creases in the paper, and that prevents you getting a misshapen bread from the paper. And then I sort of had a bit of trouble getting my pumpkin seeds to stick on the top. You don't have to add pumpkin seeds to the top, but of course it's a pumpkin bread. I had to add pumpkin seeds, and they just look pretty cool, and they taste amazing when they're roasted with the bread. So that's a nice flavour addition if you want to do that. And then I leave the dough to proof took about an hour and a half on this afternoon, and you can tell it's proofed. It should feel pretty light to touch. It should visibly be risen again. And when it's almost ready, get your Dutch oven or whatever pot you're going to bake your bread in. I'm taking my other pot out of the oven and putting my Dutch oven in. I have various baking pots that I use for my bread baking. Today I'm using my blue round Dutch oven, so I put that in, and I preheat my oven to 220 Celsius, which I think is about 410 Fahrenheit. I'll put all the details for that in the recipe. And there it is. The dough is ready to bake. It's nicely puffed up, but not too far gone, not too far risen. You don't want to look for the same rise that you would look for in a commercial yeast risen bread. Sourdough is going to be more subtle, particularly 100% whole grain sourdough. You want to look for a more subtle rise. It's just so easy to overproof these doughs, and then you end up with a hockey puck. So when your dough is ready to go and your oven is really nice and hot, your Dutch oven is preheated if you're using that, pick your dough up by the paper as I did, pop it into the Dutch oven, give it a good spray with water, put the lid on, be really careful because this Dutch oven is going to be really, really hot. And then I'm just playing around with some different oven settings. I tried convection for this bake. Normally I use the fan, so I'm trying convection this time. And give it half an hour with the lid on. Then after half an hour, take the lid off and have a look. It should be pretty close to done. It looks amazing. Smells incredible. But after that half an hour, I take the lid off and just bake it for another 10 or 15 minutes. I like my breads very well done, particularly whole grain sourdough. I think they need a really good baking. It certainly gives you a very good flavour, and you don't get gummy bits inside the bread then. Beautiful. This is ready to take out now. I just peel off that baking paper off the bottom of the bread. Take that off straight away. You want the bread to be nice and dry and air out on your cooling rack. And then you should be pretty happy by this stage. You made a gorgeous pumpkin spiced sourdough bread. It's slightly burnt. It's not really burnt, but it is slightly crispy on the bottom. But that's me playing around with my oven. And Dutch ovens, it does smell so good. I was really happy with the bake. It's a gorgeous loaf of bread. And for a heritage red wheat, freshly milled flour, and considering there was no water, there was honey and spice and pumpkin, I think I got a pretty good crumb. There are probably ways that you could make this bread and get a more impressive crumb, but honestly, the bread is soft. It has a nice mouthfeel. It tastes delicious. See those little gummy bits? don't be afraid of those. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your bread. Everybody gets those, but they never show you in the photos on Instagram because they pick them all off. But lots of people who make whole grain sourdough bread get those little gummy bits. There's nothing wrong with them, especially with this kind of bread. If you're making, you can see me picking them off there. If you're using purees and different ingredients like this, you're going to get a more dense bread, but you want it moist. You don't want it dry. So don't be afraid of tiny little bits of gumminess in your bread. It's all a good thing. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, everybody. Some 100% whole wheat spiced pumpkin sourdough bread. Really easy method. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.